She hid inside his empire for 3 years wearing fake glasses and a stolen name, and he let her. The most feared man in Manhattan's criminal underworld knew exactly who she was from the very beginning. Every time she nearly got caught, his hand moved quietly in the dark to protect her. No demands, no threats, no explanations, just silence. And when she finally walked into his office and confessed everything, trembling, furious, humiliated, he signed her freedom papers without reading a single line. That was the moment Zuri Bennett realized the most dangerous thing about Kang Tae-hyun wasn't his power. It was his patience. Drop a like, comment the city you're watching from, and follow this story to the end. Let's see how far this reaches. The contract arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of mundane detail that made it worse. Not a Friday, when the week was already broken and bad news felt appropriate. Not a Monday, when the body was still braced for punishment. A Tuesday, the most forgettable day of the week, and Zuri Bennett found it tucked inside a manila envelope between a utility bill and a coupon circular for a grocery store her mother hadn't shopped at in 6 years. She almost didn't open it. She was running late. She had a client presentation in 40 minutes, a coffee that had gone cold on the kitchen counter, and a subway line that had been running 12 minutes behind schedule every morning for the past 2 weeks without explanation or apology. She grabbed the envelope because her name was on it, slid it into her bag without thinking, and didn't look at it again until she was sitting on the train with her portfolio balanced across her knees and her earbuds in, and the city grinding past the scratched windows in long gray smears. The document inside was 7 pages long. It was written in formal legal language, dense, precise, the kind of language designed to feel inevitable. And it took her 2 full readings before her brain accepted what her eyes were seeing. Her mother had signed a contract 15 years ago. A marriage arrangement between the Bennett family and a family named Kang, formalized through a legal instrument that carried the weight of a binding agreement between 2 parties with significant financial entanglements. The Kang family, represented by a conglomerate called Black Phoenix Holdings, had provided the Bennett family with substantial capital investment during a period of severe financial crisis. In exchange, the agreement specified that the eldest daughter of Margaret Bennett, one Zuri Adeyes Bennett, born in Brooklyn, New York, would formally enter into a marriage arrangement with the eldest son of the Kang family upon reaching the age of 26. She was 26 years, 3 months, and 11 days old. The contract gave her 30 days to accept. Zuri sat on that train for 4 stops past her station. She didn't notice. She was reading the document a 3rd time, not because she didn't understand it. She understood it fine. Her hands had gone cold, and she understood it perfectly. But because some part of her brain kept expecting the words to rearrange themselves into something less insane. They didn't. The document was real. The notary stamps were real. Her mother's signature at the bottom of page 6 was real. Margaret Adeyes Bennett. In the same looping cursive she used to sign Zuri's school permission slips, the same hand that had braided her hair every Sunday morning when she was small. She got off the train at the next stop, stood on the platform while people pushed past her, and called her mother. The phone rang 4 times. "Zuri, when were you going to tell me?" Not a question. She didn't have the energy to make it a question. Her mother's silence lasted exactly 3 seconds, which was long enough to confirm that this was not a surprise to Margaret Bennett. "I was going to explain—" "When?" Zuri's voice was flat. She was watching a pigeon pick at something near the edge of the platform, and she was gripping her phone hard enough that her fingers ached. Before or after the 30 days ran out. The situation is more complicated than— "Mom." She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment, breathed. "I need you to tell me that this isn't real." Her mother didn't say that. What she said instead was that the family had been in a very difficult position 15 years ago. What she said was that the Kang investment had saved them from losing everything: the house, the business her father had spent 20 years building, the stability that Zuri and her younger siblings had grown up taking for granted. What she said was that she had believed the arrangement would never need to be enforced, that the Kang family had moved on, that years of silence had felt like tacit dissolution. What she said finally, in a voice that was smaller than Zuri had heard from her in years, was, "They activated the penalty clause." Zuri closed her eyes. The penalty clause was on page 4. She had read it twice. If the engagement was not formalized within 30 days of the activation notice, the Bennett family would be required to repay the full original investment with 15 years of accumulated interest. The number at the bottom of that clause was not a number Zuri's family had. It was not a number her family could get. "I need to think," Zuri said. "Zuri, I need to think, Mom. I'll call you later." She hung up before her mother could say anything else, stood on the platform for another 2 minutes, and then walked back up the stairs into the morning because her client presentation wasn't going to give her the day off just because her life had detonated on a Tuesday. She was good at compartmentalizing. She had always been good at taking the thing that was destroying her and folding it up small, pressing it into a back corner of her mind, and functioning anyway. She gave the presentation. The clients loved the mock-ups. She smiled and shook hands and collected her things and took the train back to her apartment in Crown Heights. And it wasn't until she was sitting at her drafting table in the quiet of her own space, with her portfolio open in front of her and the contract unfolded beside it, that she let herself think clearly. She was not going to do it. That was the first thing, and it was non-negotiable. And she sat with it long enough to make sure it was solid. She was not going to marry a stranger. She was not going to let a piece of paper signed before she was old enough to understand what a contract was determine the shape of her life. Her mother's fear and her mother's debt and her mother's choices 15 years ago were real things. They were real and they mattered, and she would find a way to address them. But they were not going to swallow her whole. The second thing was harder. If she refused outright, her family lost everything. She spent 4 hours that night researching Black Phoenix Holdings. It took her 20 minutes to find out that the company was real, that it was large, larger than she'd expected, with subsidiaries across finance, real estate, and international trade. It took another hour to find that behind the legitimate corporate structure, if you knew where to look, there were the right kinds of whispers. The kind that didn't appear in press releases. The kind that appeared in the gaps between court filings and the careful language of anonymous financial journalism. Kang Tae-hyun, the current chairman of Black Phoenix Holdings, was 34 years old. He had inherited the company from his father 6 years ago. His public profile was minimal. A handful of photographs at industry events, a brief profile in a Korean business magazine that said very little of substance. His face in those photographs was composed, angular, watchful in a way that didn't read as nerves. He looked like a man who had decided exactly how much of himself to show and was showing precisely that much and no more. Below the surface of the corporate record, the whispers said other things. They said Black Phoenix was the legitimate arm of something older and less visible. They said the Kang family's reach extended well beyond boardrooms. They said Kang Tae-hyun was not a man who lost when the people around him weren't watching. Zuri stared at his photograph for a long time. Then she pulled out a fresh piece of paper and started sketching. Not designs, not work, just shapes, the way she always did when her mind was working through something it hadn't solved yet. Her hand moved across the page while her brain turned the problem over and over, examining it from different angles, looking for the edge. She found it at 2 a.m. She couldn't refuse. She couldn't comply. She couldn't fight the contract legally without resources she didn't have and time she didn't have more of. But she could do something else. She could go inside. She could get close enough to understand the contract's architecture, find its weaknesses, find a way to dissolve it that didn't cost her family everything. She could take the weapon apart from the inside. She needed access to Black Phoenix Holdings. She needed to be someone they'd never notice. She needed to not be Zuri Bennett. It took her a week to build the identity. She was a graphic designer. She knew how to construct an image, how to decide what an audience saw and what they didn't. She researched Black Phoenix's open positions, studied their design team's public work, calibrated her fake portfolio to match the aesthetic gap she could see in their existing brand language. She found a name that felt forgettable in the right way. Rory Blake, plain enough to slide off memory, distinct enough not to raise flags. She altered her appearance in ways that were subtle but effective. A pair of heavy frame glasses that changed the geometry of her face, a shift in how she wore her hair, a wardrobe of oversized structured blazers that muted the silhouette she'd spent years building. She practiced a slightly different cadence in conversation, quieter, more deferential, the kind of person who was easy to overlook in a meeting. She applied for the junior design position under the name Rory Blake, with a portfolio that was good enough to get her in the door, but not so extraordinary that it would generate the kind of attention that led to photographs. She got the interview, she got the job, On a rainy Monday morning, 3 weeks after finding the contract, Zuri Bennett walked into the lobby of Black Phoenix Holdings as Rory Blake and did not look up at the security cameras and did not let her hand shake when the receptionist handed her a visitor badge and did not think about what she was doing because if she thought about it for one more second, she was going to turn around and walk back out into the rain and never stop. She didn't think about it. She went up. The design floor was on the 22nd level. It was open plan, well lit, the kind of workspace that had been built by someone with enough budget to make it look like the kind of place where people wanted to work. Her team lead was a Korean-American woman named Ji-yeon Park, who had a precisely organized desk and a habit of giving feedback in bullet points, and who shook Zuri's hand with a firm grip and said, "Welcome to the team, Rory," in a tone that was professional and only mildly curious. Zuri shook her hand back and said, "Thank you. I'm excited to be here," in a voice that was steady, and found her assigned workstation, and sat down and opened her laptop and spent the first 2 hours doing exactly what a junior designer on her first day would do, orienting, observing, staying quiet. She was looking for the contract. She didn't find it in 2 hours. She didn't find it in the first 2 weeks. What she found instead was a company that was larger and more layered than its public profile suggested, a design department that was genuinely understaffed and therefore genuinely grateful for competent help, and a corporate culture that ran on a precise hierarchy that was almost never made explicit but was always felt. Kang Tae-hyun occupied the top floor. The executive elevator required a keycard she didn't have. She learned that he arrived before 7 most mornings and rarely left before 9 at night, and that his presence in the building was something the rest of the staff navigated around the way you navigate around weather, not with fear exactly, but with careful attention. She didn't see him in person for the first 3 weeks. Then she did. It was a Wednesday afternoon and she was coming back from the printer room on the 23rd floor. She'd taken the stairs because the elevator was slow, and she was carrying oversized mock-up boards. When she came around a corner and nearly walked directly into him. He was taller than she'd expected from photographs. He was wearing a dark suit with no tie, and he had a folder in one hand and a phone pressed against his ear with the other. And he stopped when she stopped, and for one suspended moment they were standing about 4 feet apart, and she was staring at him over the top of her mock-up boards, and his eyes were on her with an expression she couldn't fully read. He ended the call. "Are you lost?" he said. His English was unaccented. His voice was quieter than she'd expected from a man of his reputation, not soft, but controlled, the kind of quiet that came from never needing to be loud. "No," she said. Her voice came out even. "Just the printer room. I work on 22. He looked at the mock-up boards. His expression didn't change. "The Callaway account?" She didn't ask how he knew. "Yes." He nodded once, a minimal thing, barely an acknowledgement, and stepped aside to let her pass. She walked past him and did not increase her pace and did not exhale until she had turned the corner and the hallway had given her back her privacy. Her hands were shaking by the time she reached the stairs, not because of who he was, not because of the contract, because of the way he'd looked at her. Not predatory, not suspicious, but with the particular quality of attention that she associated with people who saw more than they let on. She had spent 3 weeks building herself into someone forgettable, and in 10 seconds in a hallway, she had the cold, lurching feeling that she had not been forgettable at all. She went back to her desk. She worked. She told herself she was being paranoid. The months moved. Fall shifted into winter, and winter into a gray, grinding New York spring. She got better at being Rory Blake. She learned the rhythms of the office, the interpersonal geography of the design floor, which senior team members to approach with questions and which ones to avoid. She learned that Ji-yeon Park respected precision above all else, and that the fastest way to earn her trust was to deliver exactly what you promised, exactly when you promised it. She did that, consistently, for 6 months, and at the end of those 6 months, Ji-yeon told her she was being moved to a mid-level position on the brand strategy team. It was a promotion she hadn't pursued. It was also a promotion she couldn't refuse without drawing exactly the kind of attention she was trying to avoid. She took it. The brand strategy team met with executive leadership quarterly. That was how she ended up in a conference room on the 31st floor for the first time, seated near the end of a long table, her portfolio in front of her, watching Kang Tae-hyun enter the room and take a seat at the head of the table and begin the meeting without preamble or ceremony. He presented with the same quality she'd felt in the hallway, contained, precise, the kind of attention that made every person in the room feel both seen and slightly uncertain. He asked questions that were brief and specific and that had the uncomfortable quality of revealing that he had already thought further ahead than anyone else in the conversation. When he looked at the team's current brand projections and paused for a moment, nobody spoke into the pause. He looked up. His gaze moved down the table. It stopped on her for a fraction of a second longer than it stopped on anyone else. The identity system is inconsistent across platforms, he said. Not to her specifically, to the room. The visual language is strong in print but loses coherence in digital application. I'd like a proposal for a unified system by the end of the quarter. The meeting moved on. She told herself the pause had been nothing. She didn't believe it, but she told herself anyway. She put together the unified brand system proposal. She worked on it for 3 weeks in the evenings after the office emptied out, staying at her desk while the building went quiet around her, because the work was genuinely interesting, and because she was better at it than she'd let on, and because some part of her that she hadn't fully examined yet wanted to do it right, regardless of everything else. She submitted it through Ji-yeon. She didn't expect to hear back directly. She was at her desk on a Thursday morning when an email arrived from Tae-hyun's executive assistant requesting her presence in the executive suite at 3 o'clock to discuss her proposal. Her stomach dropped. She went up at 3. The executive suite was different from the rest of the building. Quieter, more spare, with the kind of intentional restraint that cost more than ornamentation. His assistant, a composed young man named Daniel, showed her to a meeting room and brought her water and told her Mr. Kong would be a few minutes. And she sat at the small conference table and breathed and reminded herself that she was Rory Blake, and Rory Blake was not afraid. Tae-hyun came in at 3:08. He had the proposal printed and annotated in the margins in a small, precise hand. He set it on the table without sitting, stood across from her with his arms loosely crossed, and said, "You restructured the entire approach." The original brief was too narrow, she said. Solving the digital print inconsistency in isolation doesn't address the underlying problem. Which is, the brand doesn't have a clear point of view about what it's for. It has aesthetics. It doesn't have a position. You can't create visual consistency when the conceptual foundation is ambiguous. He looked at her for a moment. You've been with the company 8 months. Yes. And your read is that the brand lacks a point of view. My read is that the brand is managed by committee and it shows. Every visual decision is a negotiation between competing preferences instead of an expression of a defined identity. She stopped, recalibrated. That's my read. I could be wrong. He uncrossed his arms, pulled out the chair across from her, and sat. You're not wrong. He opened the proposal to the 3rd page. Walk me through this section. They talked for 40 minutes. It was the longest conversation she'd had with anyone at Black Phoenix that wasn't about a specific deliverable, and it was, she couldn't deny it even to herself, the most alive she'd felt in a professional context in years. He pushed back on 2 of her conceptual frameworks with specific, well-reasoned counterarguments, and both times she held her ground, and both times he listened to her response and adjusted his position and moved on without ego. He asked questions the way a person asked questions when they were genuinely trying to understand something, not when they were trying to demonstrate that they already knew. At the end of the 40 minutes, he closed the proposal and said, I want to expand the scope. Full brand identity review across all subsidiaries. I need a lead on this project. She knew what was coming before he said it. I'm recommending you. She should have said no. Every rational calculation she'd made for the past 8 months said she should have said no. That more visibility was danger. That advancement meant scrutiny. That the closer she got to the center of Black Phoenix, the more likely it became that someone would look at her face and see past Rory Blake and see Zuri Bennett. She said, I'd like that. She didn't examine why until later that night, sitting at her drafting table in Crown Heights with a glass of water going warm beside her hand, her sketchbook open to a page she'd been filling with shapes that weren't designs. And she recognized them, finally, as the visual vocabulary she'd been developing in her head for months. The way Black Phoenix should look, if it had a real point of view. The way she'd been building the answer to a question that had only been asked aloud that afternoon. She had made herself forgettable, and then she had walked into his office and been herself for 40 minutes. That was the mistake. She knew it was the mistake. She wasn't sure she cared. Winter came. The brand project expanded across 3 months and pulled her into cross-departmental meetings, external agency coordination, and 2 separate presentations to the executive team. She managed it from behind the Rory Blake identity with the focus and control of someone walking a very thin line above a very long drop. Every time she sat in the executive conference room, she felt the pull of the line underfoot. Slight, but there. What she did not expect was the small things. The Tuesday morning in December when Tae-hyun's mother, a woman named Mrs. Kang, who arrived with the particular energy of someone accustomed to deference, swept through the executive floor for an unannounced visit, and Zuri, who was there to drop off mock-up revisions, had ducked into the boardroom to avoid being in the hallway when the older woman passed. She crouched behind the far end of the conference table, bag in her lap, listening to Mrs. Kang's heels click past in the corridor outside. And when the footsteps faded, she found a bottle of water sitting on the floor beside her knee. She looked up. Nobody was there. She picked up the bottle, cold, newly opened. She thought about it for a long time. The February afternoon when a company photographer arrived to compile a staff directory, and Zuri spent 40 minutes maneuvering around the photo assignments on the design floor, volunteering to run coffee and review proofs and do anything that kept her out of the camera's frame. And when she came back to her desk, she found that her name had been removed from the photography schedule entirely and replaced with a note that she was working a remote assignment. She had not requested that. March, a corporate celebration for a subsidiary acquisition. The entire company on the rooftop terrace with champagne and city lights. And she was standing near the edge of a conversation with 2 members of the legal team when one of them asked her casually what brought her to Black Phoenix before her current position. And she felt the specific cold electricity of the question and started to answer. And across the terrace, across 20 feet and 2 clusters of people, Tae-hyun said something to the legal team member's supervisor that pulled both of them away mid-sentence. And the conversation dissolved before she had to answer. She stood at the railing afterward, looking at the city, and let herself think clearly for the first time in months. He knew. She didn't know how long he'd known. She didn't know what he was going to do with it, but the water bottle and the photography schedule and the rooftop and the 47 other small things she'd cataloged in the back of her mind for 8 months. They added up to something that only had one shape. He knew, and he wasn't saying anything. And every time the situation got close to dangerous, his hand moved quietly somewhere she couldn't quite see. She sat with that knowledge for a month. She turned it over. She examined it from every angle her mind could reach. She was still examining it, still turning it in her hands like a stone she couldn't identify. When she came back to her desk on a Monday morning in April and found that her mother had called 4 times, and when she finally listened to the voicemail, her mother's voice was thin and frightened, and she said 2 words that made everything close in at once. They're coming. The penalty clause. The 30 days. The money. The ruin. Zuri sat at her desk in Black Phoenix Holdings, surrounded by the work she had built under a stolen name, and looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and understood with sudden, absolute clarity that the time she had bought herself was gone. She had gone inside to destroy the contract. Instead, she had spent a year and a half building something she hadn't planned on, and now the only way out ran straight through the one door she had been circling since the beginning. She picked up her bag. She took the executive elevator. She went to the 31st floor, and for the first time in 18 months, she walked toward Kang Tae-hyun's office as herself. The executive elevator made no sound when it moved. That was the thing she noticed, standing inside it with her bag against her hip and her reflection broken into fragments by the brushed steel panels, the whole mechanism rising 31 floors in a silence so complete it felt pressurized. Like the building was holding its breath, like it knew something was about to change and hadn't decided yet whether to allow it. The doors opened. Daniel looked up from his desk with the practiced composure of someone who had been trained not to show surprise, but she caught the half-second recalibration in his eyes, the quick internal adjustment of a man who had cataloged every person permitted on this floor and was now encountering one who wasn't on the list. "Rory," he said, carefully, "I need to see him. Mr. Kang is in a call until—" "I know." She was already moving past the desk. "Tell him Rory Blake is here. Tell him it's about the contract." She said the last word without inflection. Just a word. But Daniel's composure shifted again, barely, and she saw it, and she kept walking toward the closed office door at the end of the hall, and did not let herself slow down because if she slowed down, she was going to stop, and if she stopped, she was going to leave. And if she left, she was never coming back. She knocked twice. Didn't wait. She pushed the door open. Kang Tae-hyun was standing at the window wall, phone to his ear, looking at the city 40 stories below with his back to the door. He turned at the sound of her entry. Not startled, just turning, the way a man turned when he had already heard someone coming and had decided to let them arrive. He looked at her for one unreadable moment, said something brief and final into the phone in Korean, and ended the call. He set the phone on his desk. He looked at her. "Close the door," he said. She did. The office was spare in the way expensive things were spare. Nothing unnecessary, nothing accidental, the furniture chosen with the same quality of deliberate restraint she had come to associate with everything about him. Floor-to-ceiling windows on two sides, a desk that was clear except for a single open folder, a credenza along the far wall with a row of architectural models that she had always been curious about and had never been close enough to examine. She had thought about this moment for months. She had run it in her mind in dozens of versions. What she would say first, how he would respond, what his face would do when she said her real name out loud in this room. She had never fully believed she would actually be standing here. She was standing here. "My name isn't Rory Blake," she said. He didn't react. Not a flicker. Not a shift in his expression. Nothing that suggested this was news. He moved around his desk and sat. Not behind it, on the edge of it, arms crossed, watching her with that quality of attention that she had spent 18 months trying not to think about. "I know," he said. The two words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. She had prepared for denial. She had prepared for anger, for the specific controlled fury she imagined a man like him would carry, for threats or demands, or the cold mechanics of power being applied. She had not fully prepared for this. For the quiet, factual acknowledgement of a man who had been sitting on the information for so long, it had lost its urgency. "How long?" she said. "The first month." She absorbed that. 1 month. She had been in this building for 18 months. "The hallway," she said. "The printer room." "Before that. Your portfolio had a piece in it, a brand identity project for a nonprofit. The color system was distinctive. I'd seen it before, in an industry showcase 3 years ago. The designer's name was Zuri Bennett." He uncrossed his arms, set his hands on the desk edge on either side of him. "I pulled your file after the hallway to confirm." She thought about the portfolio she had spent a week carefully calibrating. The piece she had kept because it was old enough, she'd thought, and obscure enough. She thought about the 3 weeks of careful identity construction. She thought about 18 months of performing invisibility. "And you didn't say anything?" "No." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive. She had spent enough time reading his silences to know the difference between evasion and thought. This was thought. "You weren't hurting anyone, Tut," he said finally. "You were doing the work, and you were doing it well." A pause. "I wanted to see what you were building." Something about that answer made her angrier than denial would have. "You wanted to see," she repeated. "Yes. I have been living a double life in your company for a year and a half," she said, and her voice was still even. She was holding it even. "Because your family put a contract on my life before I could drive a car, and you wanted to see what I was building. I understand why you're angry. You don't." She put her bag down on the chair beside her, not gently. "You understand the words. You don't understand what it's like to be 26 years old and find out that your mother signed you away to a stranger, and you have 30 days to figure out how not to destroy your family in the process of refusing. You don't understand what it's like to walk into a building every single day for 18 months, knowing that if someone looks at you too closely, everything ends." Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. She pressed them flat against her thighs. "So, no, you don't understand why I'm angry." He didn't argue with that. She opened her bag and took out the envelope. It had been in her bag since her mother's voicemail. She had printed it that morning, the dissolution agreement her lawyer had drafted. 7 pages that said in formal legal language that the contract between the Bennett family and the Kang family was null and void, that the penalty clause was unenforceable, that both parties agreed to release each other from all obligations. Her lawyer had told her the enforceability argument was weak. She knew that. She set it on his desk. "I need you to sign this," she said, "and I need you to not enforce the penalty clause. My family doesn't have that money." She made herself meet his eyes. "I know you could make this very difficult. I know what you can do, and I'm here anyway because there isn't another option, and I'm done pretending there is. He looked at the envelope. He didn't pick it up. "There's something I need to tell you first," he said. "I don't want Zuri." Her name, her real name, in his voice, in this room, stopped her completely. She hadn't heard her own name spoken aloud in this building in 18 months. The sound of it hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. He picked up the envelope, not to open it, just held it for a moment, turned it once in his hands. "I didn't activate the penalty clause," he said. "My mother did, 3 weeks ago, without my authorization." He set it back down. "I found out 4 days after the fact." She stared at him. "That's—" She stopped. "That's not—" She stopped again. The notice came from Black Phoenix. From her, using the company's legal infrastructure. She has certain legacy authorities in the family structures, things I haven't fully restructured. His jaw moved slightly. "That's an internal problem I should have resolved earlier." "Why would she—" "Because she wants the alliance formalized. Because she believes the contract represents a commitment my family made and that commitment should be honored." He paused. "Because she found out approximately 2 months ago that you were working in this building." The room got very quiet. "She knows who I am," Zuri said. "She suspects. She doesn't have confirmation. She's been—" He stopped, started again more carefully. "She's been pressing me for information about Rory Blake. She thinks the presence of a woman matching your general description in this company is not a coincidence. She wants to verify." Zuri's mind moved fast through the implications. The months rewinding. Mrs. Kang's visit in December. The specific quality of the older woman's attention when she walked the executive floor. The way the staff had moved differently around her than they moved around Tae-hyun. She thought about Daniel downstairs right now with his phone in his hand. "Does she know I'm here?" Zuri said. "In this office, right now." "Probably," he said, "within the next few minutes." She picked up her bag. "Don't," he said. Not a command, just the word. "I need to leave." "If you leave now, she'll follow. She has people watching the building." He said it without drama, as a fact. "If you walk out of here in the next 30 minutes, you won't make it 2 blocks before someone stops you and asks you to come have a conversation with her. And that conversation will not go the way you want it to." Zuri stood very still and thought about her mother's voicemail, and the 4 missed calls, and the fear in Margaret Bennett's voice, and the number at the bottom of page 4 of the original contract. And she felt the walls of the situation close in another degree, and she breathed through it. "So what do you suggest?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Stay," he said. 15 minutes. Let me make a call." She almost laughed. "Stay. I know how that sounds." "Do you?" "Yes." Something moved briefly in his expression. Not quite humor, not quite pain. Something in between that she didn't have a name for yet. "I know exactly how that sounds. And I'm asking anyway." She didn't sit. She stayed standing, her bag on her shoulder, and looked at the city through his windows while he picked up his phone and made a call in Korean, speaking quietly, the conversation brief and final in tone. She didn't speak Korean well enough to follow it. She watched the city and breathed and told herself that the situation was still controllable because she needed to believe that. He ended the call. "She's being redirected to a lunch meeting that will last approximately 2 hours, he said. "Her chief of staff will keep her occupied. You can do that." "When I need to." He stood from the desk. "It buys time, that's all." She turned back from the window. He was standing close enough that she was aware of the specific quality of the silence between them. Not uncomfortable, which was almost the most unsettling thing about it. She had spent 18 months keeping a careful, calibrated distance from this man. She had built systems for it. The systems were not working the way they were supposed to. "She's not going to stop," Zuri said. "Your mother." "No." "And the penalty clause." "I'll handle the penalty clause." She shook her head. "That's not—" "I'm not asking you to handle it. I'm asking you to sign the dissolution agreement and let my family walk away from this clean. That's all I'm asking." "I know." "Then sign it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked to his desk, picked up a pen, opened the envelope, and read through the document with the focused speed of someone who read legal documents often. He went through all 7 pages. He didn't rush. She watched him read and told herself she wasn't watching him and kept watching anyway. He signed it on the last page. His signature was small and controlled, the way everything about him was small and controlled. He closed the document, put it back in the envelope, and held it out to her. She took it. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. Why not? Because it doesn't solve the problem, he said. My mother activated that clause without my authorization, but that doesn't make it invalid. Your family's legal exposure is real, and it doesn't disappear because I signed a dissolution document your lawyer drafted. She'll challenge it. Zuri looked at the envelope in her hands. Then I'll fight the challenge. With what resources? She didn't answer that because she didn't have an answer. The room stayed quiet for a moment. There's another option, he said. She looked up. I'm not proposing the contract, he said, and his voice was careful in a way that told her he had thought about how to say this before she arrived. I'm aware of how that sounds, and I'm not suggesting it, but there is a structural path that removes the leverage entirely, that makes the penalty clause irrelevant because it closes the conditions under which it can be applied. What kind of structural path? A formal announcement of an engagement, he said. Temporary, staged, long enough for me to remove my mother's legacy authorities from the company structure and dismantle the clause properly. 3 months, possibly 4. Then a mutual dissolution that the family couldn't legally contest because the contractual conditions would have been technically met and voluntarily ended. She stared at him. You're asking me to pretend to be engaged to you? I'm describing an option. That is insane. It's the cleanest path to protecting your family without a legal fight that could take 2 years and cost more than the penalty clause. He wasn't defensive, just laying it out. I understand if you refuse. I'm not. She pressed her hand against her mouth for a moment, breathed. I spent 1.5 years hiding from you. I just walked in here to hand you a piece of paper that ends this. And your solution is more contract. My solution is no more contract. Eventually. This is the mechanism to get there. She looked at him, really looked, the way she had been carefully not looking for 18 months, the way she had trained herself not to, because looking clearly at Kang Tae-hyun was not something she could afford. She looked now. He looked tired, not in his posture, which was still controlled, still precise, but in something behind his eyes, the particular tiredness of a person who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had gotten very good at not showing it. She understood that tiredness. She had been living inside a version of it for 1.5 years. I need to think, she said. Of course. She picked up her bag properly. I need to not be in this building while I think. He nodded once. Daniel will take you down the back elevator. The lobby on the service side doesn't have the same coverage as the main entrance. She stopped. The camera coverage, she said slowly. The lobby cameras. You moved me away from them, didn't you? That first month, you adjusted something, because you'd pulled my file and confirmed who I was, and you moved me away from the cameras so the facial recognition wouldn't flag me. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it either. Why, she said. For 18 months. Why? He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the windows, the city moved in its relentless way. Sirens somewhere far below, a helicopter crossing the gray sky, the million small mechanical sounds of a place that never fully stopped. Because you came here to fight, he said, and I didn't want to take that away from you. She looked at him for a moment longer than she meant to. Then she walked to the door. She had her hand on the handle when his voice came across the room, quiet and even. The photograph, he said, from the industry showcase, the nonprofit project. She stopped. You designed a visual identity for a youth literacy program in the Bronx. The case study described it as pro bono work. The brief said the organization couldn't afford design services. A pause. The system you built them was better than anything our internal team produces on full budget. She didn't turn around. I kept the catalog page, he said, from the showcase. I've had it for 3 years. Her hand tightened on the door handle. I'll let you know my answer, she said, and she opened the door and walked out before he could say anything else that she wasn't ready to hear. The back elevator was where he said it would be. Daniel appeared at her elbow with the practiced discretion of someone who had been briefed without being told everything, and he walked her to the service corridor without asking questions. And the elevator opened before she pressed the button, and she went down alone in another silence. This one different from the first. This one full of things instead of empty. She came out on a side street she didn't usually use. The air was cold and smelled like diesel and standing water. She stood on the sidewalk with the dissolution agreement in her bag and Tae-hyun's voice still in her ear. Because you came here to fight, and I didn't want to take that away from you. and she looked at the street and understood with a precision that felt almost physical that she was standing at the exact edge of the thing she'd been running from for 18 months. She had her exit, the signed paper was in her bag, and it wasn't going to be enough. She already knew it wasn't going to be enough. She had known it, probably, before she came up. The penalty clause was real, and Mrs. Kang was real, and a signed dissolution document from a lawyer with limited resources was not going to hold against the legal infrastructure of a company like Black Phoenix. She had her exit, and she couldn't use it, and the only other door was the one that led back inside. She was still standing on the sidewalk, not moving, when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. It wasn't her mother. The number was one she didn't recognize. A Korean country code, clean international format. She stared at it for 2 full rings. She answered. A woman's voice, clear, cultured, with the specific precision of someone who had learned English as a performance rather than a language. Miss Blake, the voice said. Or perhaps I should use your real name. I think that would be more honest, don't you? My son has always preferred honesty, even when he practices other things. Zuri's hand went cold around the phone. Mrs. Kang, she said. We should meet, the woman said pleasantly. Today, I think. Before you make any decisions you can't take back. I know a place near the building. Very quiet, very private. I'll text you the address. A pause, perfectly timed. I do hope you'll come, because the alternative I have in mind for your family is considerably less comfortable than a conversation. The call ended. Zuri looked at the street, looked at the building she'd just come out of, looked at the phone in her hand as the text arrived. An address 6 blocks east, a restaurant she'd never been to, a time that was 40 minutes from now. She had the signed paper, she had the exit, she had 40 minutes, and somewhere above her, 31 floors up, the most complicated man she'd ever refused to understand was sitting in his office knowing that his mother had just made her first move. And she understood, suddenly and completely, that everything she had built and everything she had run from and everything she had almost let herself want had just collapsed into a single point. She started walking east. The restaurant was called Sora. It occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on 54th Street, the kind of place that had no sign visible from the sidewalk, just a brushed steel door and a small intercom panel, and a single potted tree pruned into an unnatural shape standing sentinel beside the entrance. The kind of place that existed to be invisible to people who hadn't been told about it. Zuri stood outside it for 30 seconds. The wind came off the avenue and pushed against her back, and the city moved around her in its indifferent way. And she thought about turning around, about calling her lawyer, about calling her mother, about doing literally anything other than walking through that door. She walked through the door. Inside was quiet the way money was quiet. Not silent, but insulated. The noise of the street reduced to something distant and irrelevant. Low lighting, tables spaced far apart. A host who looked at her without expression and said, Mrs. Kang is expecting you, and led her toward the back without waiting to see if she followed. Mrs. Kang was already seated at a corner table with a glass of water and a small plate of something Zuri didn't look at. And she was smaller in person than she had seemed from across an executive hallway. Compact, elegantly dressed, with the particular quality of stillness that belonged to people who had learned long ago that they didn't need to perform power because they had it. She looked up when Zuri approached. Sit down, she said. Not unkindly, just as a fact. Zuri sat. Up close, the resemblance to Taehyun was specific and strange, something in the set of the eyes, the quality of the attention. But where Taehyun's watchfulness had always felt to Zuri like a form of patience, his mother's had the quality of assessment. She was being measured. She had been being measured since before she sat down. You're prettier without the glasses, Mrs. Kang said. Zuri said nothing. That was a compliment. You don't have to look at me like that. The older woman lifted her water glass, took a small sip, set it down with precision. I've known about you for 4 months. In case you're wondering how thorough my information is. 4 months, Zuri said. Not 2. Something moved briefly in Mrs. Kang's expression. A small recalibration, quickly contained. My son told you 2 months. He told me you found out 2 months ago. My son, Mrs. Kang said carefully, knows what I choose to share with him, which is not always everything. She folded her hands on the table. Her nails were short and unpainted, and her rings were simple and very good. I've been watching you since January. I wanted to understand what you were doing before I decided what to do about it. January. 4 months of surveillance Zuri hadn't detected. She thought about all the small, careful movements of the past 18 months, the routes she varied, the cameras she tracked, the identity she'd maintained with such methodical precision, and felt something cold move through her that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger, but lived in the territory between them. "You didn't tell your son," Zuri said. "I tell my son what is useful for him to know when it is useful for him to know it." Mrs. Kong's tone was matter of fact. Tae-hyun is very capable. He is also, in certain areas, not as practical as he believes himself to be. "What areas?" The older woman looked at her steadily. "The area we're sitting in right now." Zuri kept her face neutral and her hands flat on her thighs under the table. "You activated the penalty clause." "I did. Without your son's authorization. I have certain retained authorities in the family's legal structures. They're mine to use." "He's the chairman." "He is," Mrs. King nodded once. "And I am his mother, and before that I was the person who built the foundation he chairs. The contract was made under my authority as well as my husband's. My husband is gone. The authority remains mine." She said this without heat, without defensiveness, as something that simply was. "I didn't activate it to punish you, Miss Bennett. I activated it because the deadline was real and because my son was not going to act on it himself. Because he doesn't want the contract enforced. Because he is being sentimental about a situation that requires practicality." For the first time, something moved in Mrs. Kang's voice. Not anger, not warmth, but a kind of compressed weight. "My son has spent 3 years quietly protecting a woman who came into his company under a false identity to undermine a legal agreement, and he did this because he found her interesting." She paused. "I find that concerning." Zuri breathed slowly. "He signed the dissolution agreement." "I know." "Then the contract is not dissolved." Mrs. Kang's voice was still pleasant. "A dissolution agreement signed by one party under circumstances that could be characterized as coercion, you entering his office unannounced while my son was managing a sensitive business situation, has limited legal weight, particularly against a contract with the original enforcement mechanisms ours carries." She tilted her head slightly. "Did your lawyer explain that to you?" Her lawyer had explained exactly that. She said nothing. "The penalty clause stands," Mrs. Kang said. "Your family's exposure is real. The amount owed is real. And I want you to understand that I take no pleasure in this. Your family's difficulty is not something I engineered. Your mother made an agreement, and I am asking for it to be honored. That is all. By forcing me to marry your son. By asking you to consider it seriously, yes." She unfolded her hands. "I've read your work. I'm not unaware of who you are as a professional. I'm not asking you to disappear. I'm asking you to stop running from something that might not be worth running from." Zuri looked at the woman across the table and felt something crystallize in her chest. Not the cold fear of the past hour, but something cleaner and harder. "You don't know what it's worth running from. You don't know anything about what I want." "No," Mrs. Kang agreed. "I don't. That's fair." She reached into the structured bag beside her chair and took out a folder. She placed it on the table between them and did not push it forward, just left it there, in the neutral space, like something she was offering rather than delivering. "But I know what your family owes, and I know what happens to people who owe that amount to this family and cannot pay it." Her voice didn't change. "I want you to read what's in that folder before you make your decision." Zuri looked at the folder. She picked it up. Inside were 8 pages. She read the first one, and her hands went very still. It was a financial document, a detailed breakdown of her family's current debt structure, but not just the Black Phoenix obligation. Everything. Her mother's second mortgage, her brother Marcus's business loans. The medical debt from her father's illness 3 years ago that she had not known was as large as it was. The lines of credit. The gaps in the picture she had been carrying in her head of her family's situation, filled in now with numbers she had not had access to, in a document that could only have been assembled by someone with significant investigative resources. The total at the bottom of the page was not a number she had known. It was worse than the penalty clause by a factor she needed a moment to process. "Where did you get this?" she said. Her voice came out flat. "Financial information about people who are connected to my family's interests is something I make it my business to understand." Mrs. Kang's tone was not apologetic. Your mother's situation is more precarious than she has let you know. The Black Phoenix penalty clause is the largest single item, but it is not the only item. If your family loses the legal fight over the clause, and they will lose, Miss Bennett, I want you to be clear-eyed about that. The cascade effect on the rest of their financial position will be severe. Zuri set the document down. She picked up the next page. It was a different kind of document. A property record. The title to her mother's house in Fort Greene, the house Zuri had grown up in, the house where her youngest sister still lived. The title showed a lien she had not known about, registered 4 months ago, the creditor listed as a holding company with a name she didn't recognize. She went cold. That holding company, she said, is one of ours, Mrs. Kang said. Yes. The cold spread outward from her chest to her hands to the back of her neck. You put a lien on my mother's house. The lien was placed as security against the existing debt obligation. It's a standard financial protection mechanism. The older woman's voice was steady and without apology. I want you to understand the full shape of the situation, Miss Bennett. Not to frighten you, to ensure you are making your decision with complete information. This is a threat. This is a disclosure. Mrs. Kong picked up her water glass again. A threat would be me telling you what happens next if you walk out of this restaurant without agreeing to take the proposal seriously. I'm not doing that. I'm showing you the landscape and trusting you to read it accurately. Zuri looked at the folder in her hands, looked at the woman across from her, looked at the door at the far end of the restaurant that led back to the street. She had walked in here with a signed dissolution agreement and the beginning of a plan and the specific kind of furious energy that had carried her through 18 months of a double life. She was sitting here now with a folder full of information she hadn't had and a picture of her family's situation that was substantially worse than the picture she had been carrying, and the energy had not gone anywhere, but it had changed shape, and the new shape felt less like fuel and more like something she needed to be very careful with. What do you actually want from me? Zuri said. Not combative, just precise. Specifically, not the contract language. What do you want? Mrs. Kang was quiet for a moment. The first pause Zuri had seen from her, and it felt real rather than calculated. I want my son to have someone in his life who is not afraid of him, she said. That is rarer than you might think. Zuri didn't expect that answer. She sat with it for a moment, which she suspected was exactly what the older woman had intended. And if I agree to the proposal my son described to you, yes, the staged arrangement. She stopped. He told you what he offered me. He called me after you left, Mrs. Kong said. He told me what he'd proposed, and he told me he was asking me to stand down. Something moved in the older woman's expression. Brief, complicated. He also told me that if I moved against you or your family before you had time to make a decision freely, he would dissolve my retained authorities himself. Today. Zuri stared at her. He threatened his own mother. He communicated a boundary. Mrs. Kang's voice was dry. Which is something he does not do often, which is why I take it seriously when he does. She looked at Zuri directly. And which is the reason I am sitting here talking to you instead of doing the other things I considered doing. The restaurant was very quiet. Zuri was aware of the sound of her own breathing, of the distant noise of the city coming through the insulated walls, of the folder open on the table between two women who were studying each other with the careful attention of people who had each decided the other was not to be underestimated. The lien on my mother's house, Zuri said. If I agree to the proposal. Temporary, staged, as Tae-hyun described. What happens to it? It would be suspended for the duration, and dissolved at the end with the rest of the arrangement. And the other debts. The Black Phoenix obligation would be restructured. The rest is outside my direct control, but I have relationships with most of the creditors involved. I can make calls. What do you get? 3 months of my son's peace of mind, Mrs. Kong said, which he has not had in years, and which he will not admit to wanting. And perhaps, if things go as I suspect they might, something more durable than a staged arrangement. She held up one hand slightly, a small gesture. I'm not so sentimental as to bet the family's legal position on a romance. I'm practical. The practical calculation says this arrangement resolves the debt structure cleanly and closes the contract on terms that are acceptable to all parties. Everything else is additional. Bam! Das ist Beititz. Zuri closed the folder, picked it up, put it in her bag beside the dissolution agreement, which felt now like a document from a different version of today. I need to call my mother, she said. Of course. And I need to call my lawyer. Naturally. She stood up. Mrs. Kang did not stand, just looked up at her with the same quality of steady attention, waiting. If I find out, Zuri said, that there is any piece of this that you haven't disclosed, any lien, any debt, any document, any leverage I don't know about, I will burn every piece of this arrangement to the ground, and I will accept the consequences, and I want you to understand that I am not saying that as a negotiating position. Mrs. Kang looked at her for a moment. I believe you, she said. And for the first time, something in the older woman's expression shifted. Not warmth, exactly, but something adjacent to respect. That's why I'm not concerned about us reaching an agreement. Zuri picked up her bag. She walked to the door. Outside, the city hit her immediately. The noise, the cold, the diesel smell, the specific texture of Manhattan in early afternoon when the lunch crowd had thinned and the streets were in transition between urgencies. She stood on the sidewalk and pulled out her phone. She called her mother. Margaret Bennett picked up on the first ring, which meant she had been sitting with her phone in her hand. Zuri, I need you to listen to me, Zuri said. Her voice was steady. She had made it steady. I need you to listen to everything I say and not interrupt until I'm done. Can you do that? A pause. Yes. She told her mother about the folder, the complete debt picture, the lien on the house. She said the numbers clearly, without softening them, because her mother needed to understand the actual shape of the situation, and the time for managing information had passed. Her mother was quiet through all of it. She could hear her breathing, could hear the specific quality of the silence of a woman absorbing something she had been half expecting and wholly dreading. When she finished, her mother said, How bad? Bad, Zuri said, but not unsurvivable. There's a path. She looked at the traffic moving on 54th Street. I need you to trust me. I trust you. I need you to not ask me for details right now because I don't have them all, and I don't want to tell you something that changes. A longer pause. Okay. I'll call you tonight. She ended the call, stood for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she called Tae-hyun. He picked up on the second ring. She showed you the folder, he said. Not a question. Yes. Zuri started walking. Not toward the building, not toward the subway, just moving, because she needed to move while she talked. You knew about the lien. I found out this morning. When I found out about the penalty clause activation, I started looking at what else had been done without my authorization. The lien was placed 8 weeks ago. His voice carried something controlled and compressed that she recognized as anger managed very carefully. I'm sorry, I should have found it sooner. She's been watching me since January. I know. She told me after you left the building. A pause. Are you all right? The question was so plain and so without agenda that she almost didn't know what to do with it. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I'm thinking. Take the time you need. Tae-hyun. She stopped walking. She was standing at an intersection, cabs moving through the light ahead of her, the city indifferent in every direction. The things you told me this morning, about why you didn't expose me, about the photograph, about keeping the catalog page. She pressed her hand briefly against her eyes. Were those true? The pause before he answered was very short. Yes. All of it. All of it. She stood at the intersection and breathed and thought about 18 months of small interventions and the water bottle on the boardroom floor and a photograph of a nonprofit brand system kept in a drawer for 3 years, and a man who had known exactly who she was since her first month in his building and had chosen every single day to let her keep fighting. She thought about Mrs. Kang's words across the restaurant table. I want my son to have someone in his life who is not afraid of him. She thought about the fact that she had never been afraid of him. She had been afraid of the contract, afraid of exposure, afraid of losing her family's stability, afraid of a dozen things, but not of him. Somehow, in 18 months of carefully maintained distance, that had never been the fear. I'll give you my answer tomorrow morning, she said. Okay. And Tae-hyun. She looked at the light. It had changed twice while she stood there. The retained authorities. Your mother's legacy access to the company's legal structures. I need you to dissolve them. A pause. I was already planning to. Today, she said. Not eventually. Today. Another pause. Shorter. Yes. She hung up. The light changed again. She crossed the street with the crowd and kept walking, and didn't stop because if she stopped, the full weight of the day was going to land on her all at once, and she needed to be moving when it hit. She walked 6 blocks without direction, without destination, and when she finally stopped, she was standing in front of a coffee shop she didn't know, looking at her reflection in the glass. No fake glasses, no oversized blazer, just her own face in the city light looking back at her. She looked tired. She looked like herself. She went inside and ordered coffee and sat at a small table near the window and opened her bag and took out the folder and the dissolution agreement and laid them side by side on the table and looked at them for a long time. The dissolution agreement was real. Ta Hyun's signature was real. It was the exit she had come into that building to get. The folder was also real. The numbers were also real. And the exit the dissolution agreement represented led somewhere her family could not afford. She thought about the conversation with Tae-hyun in his office, the 40 minutes that had felt like the most honest professional conversation she'd had in years. She thought about the way he'd said you came here to fight without making it sound like an accusation. She thought about the architecture models on his credenza that she had never been close enough to examine and had spent 18 months being curious about. She thought about what it would mean to stop running. Not compliance, not surrender. Something else. Something she didn't have a clean word for yet. Something that looked like walking back into a situation with her eyes open instead of her disguise on. Choosing the terms instead of fleeing the one she'd been handed. She folded the dissolution agreement carefully and put it back in the envelope. She left the folder open on the table. She picked up her coffee and looked at the street through the window and made the decision that she had been making in pieces for longer than she wanted to admit. Tomorrow morning, she would give him her answer. Tonight, she needed to do one thing first. She needed to go home, to her apartment in Crown Heights, to her drafting table and her sketchbook, and the studio she had built on the salary she'd earned under a name that wasn't hers, and she needed to start designing something real, something that could only be made by Zuri Bennett, not Rory Blake, something that told the truth about what she saw when she looked at Black Phoenix from the inside. Because if she was going to walk back in there, she was going to walk in as herself. Completely, with everything she actually had. And she was going to make it impossible for anyone in that building, including Kang Tae-hyun, to look away. She finished her coffee. She packed her bag. She stood up and buttoned her coat and walked to the door. And as she pushed it open, the late afternoon light came at her low and sharp and turned everything on the street gold for a moment. And she squinted into it and kept moving because the city, she worked through the night. Not the frantic, panicked kind of working she had done in the early months at Black Phoenix. The kind driven by fear of exposure, by the constant low-level alarm of someone who knew they were standing on borrowed ground. This was different. This was the working she did when she was most herself. When the problem in front of her was large enough and real enough that everything else fell away, and there was just the table and the light and the paper and her hand moving across it. She started with the architecture, not the visual system. That came later. First the bones. She pulled everything she had accumulated in 18 months inside Black Phoenix, the brand audits, the cross-departmental inconsistencies she had cataloged, the gap she had identified in that first executive meeting between what the company presented to the world and what it actually was. She spread it across her drafting table in the order it made sense to her mind, which was not chronological and was not hierarchical, but was the order in which the pieces connected, the logic of the thing revealing itself in the arrangement. Black Phoenix had been built by 2 generations of a family that operated in 2 worlds simultaneously, the legitimate corporate structure and the older, less visible network beneath it. The brand reflected that split in ways that nobody had ever addressed directly, because addressing it directly would have required naming what the company actually was. Every visual system they had ever commissioned had tried to paper over the gap with aesthetics, strong aesthetics. Sometimes, there were pieces of their existing identity that were genuinely good. But aesthetics built on an unaddressed foundation didn't hold. They degraded. They became inconsistent, then contradictory, then incoherent. What the brand needed, what it had always needed, was a point of view about the tension itself. Not concealment, not exposure. Something harder to do than either, acknowledgement. The visual language of an organization that operated at the intersection of power and restraint, that understood the weight of what it carried, that had chosen to present itself to the world with the kind of honesty that came not from transparency, but from precision. She sketched until 3 in the morning. She slept for 4 hours on her couch without meaning to, woke with her cheek against the sketchbook, and made coffee, and kept going. By 6, she had the core concept. By 8, she had the visual language. By 10, she had a presentation structure that could be delivered in 40 minutes to an executive room and that she was, for the first time in a year and a half, not going to walk into under a false name. She showered. She put on the clothes she wanted to wear. Not the oversized blazers of Rory Blake's careful anonymity, but her own clothes, the ones that fit, the ones she'd worn before she needed to disappear. She left the fake glasses on the counter beside her coffee cup. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. Then she picked up her portfolio and went to Black Phoenix Holdings and walked through the main lobby entrance for the first time without looking away from the security cameras. The receptionist at the front desk looked at her. There was a beat, the specific beat of someone running a face against a mental database. And then the receptionist's expression shifted into something careful and professional, and she said, "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Kang Tae-hyun," Zuri said. "My name is Zuri Bennett." She said it at normal volume. She didn't look around to see who had heard. She was shown up. Different elevator than usual. The main one, the one she had spent 18 months avoiding. The lobby cameras tracked her without comment because cameras didn't comment. They just recorded. Daniel met her on 31 with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something between surprise and a particular quality of recognition. Like a man who had known something was coming and hadn't known exactly what shape it would take. "Ms. Bennett," he said, and the name in his mouth was new and careful. "He's expecting you." She followed him down the hall. The office door was open. Taehyun was standing at the window when she came in. The same position as yesterday, but different in every other way. Because yesterday she had come in trembling and furious, and today she came in with a portfolio under her arm and her own face, and 18 months of work that she had done in his company under false pretenses, and was about to present under her real name, and he turned when she entered and looked at her, really looked. The complete version of the look she'd been carefully avoiding, and said nothing for a moment. "You're not wearing the glasses," he said. "No." He looked at the portfolio. "What is that?" "Your brand system," she said. "The real one. The one the company actually needs." She moved to the conference table and set it down and opened it. "I worked on it last night. I know the board presentation is in 3 days, and I know I am not technically employed here anymore because Rory Blake doesn't exist, and I burned that bridge when I walked in the front door just now, so I need you to look at this before you decide what to do about everything else." He came to the table. She walked him through it. 40 minutes, the way she had planned. No performance, no qualification, no hedging about her position or her identity or the absurdity of the circumstance. Just the work, the way she had built it, the logic of the decisions, the system in full. He stood beside her at the table and he looked at every page and he asked 4 questions, all of them specific and good, and she answered them directly and the 40 minutes moved the way good working time always moved, which was too fast. When she reached the last page, she closed the portfolio. She looked at him. "I'm going to take the proposal," she said. "The staged arrangement. 3 months, 4 if it needs to be. The terms your mother described." She held his gaze. "But I'm going to take it on conditions." His expression didn't change. "Tell me." "I work on this project, this one, not a new brief, not a reassignment. This exact system through the board presentation and implementation, under my real name, with a proper contract." She pressed her hand flat on the portfolio. "Your mother dissolves the lien on my mother's house before I sign anything. Today, not after. And the penalty clause, I need it restructured. Not eliminated, not yet, because I understand the legal architecture, but restructured so that my family's exposure is capped at an amount that won't destroy them if something goes sideways." "Done," he said. Immediately. She blinked. She had been prepared to argue. "You didn't negotiate." "The conditions are reasonable," he said. "I was going to offer most of them before you asked." She looked at him for a moment. "This is a strange situation." "Yes. I want you to know that I'm not doing this because I don't have other options," she said. "I have other options. They're worse, but they exist, and I want you to understand that I'm making this choice with my eyes open." "I know that," he said. "I've known you for 18 months. I know how you make decisions." Something about that landed differently than she expected. Not intrusively, Not like surveillance, not like violation, more like being seen by someone who had paid attention, which was its own kind of exposure and its own kind of strange. One more thing, she said. Yes. The photograph. The catalog page from the showcase. She looked at him steadily. I want to see it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he went to his desk, not the conference table, his actual desk, the one that was always clear, and opened the center drawer and took out something and brought it back to her. It was a page torn carefully from a printed catalog. The paper was slightly worn at the fold. The photograph on the page showed a brand identity spread. Her work, the literacy program, the color system she had built on a weekend 3 years ago for an organization with no budget and a mission she believed in. Her name was in the caption at the bottom, Zuri A. Bennett, Independent Designer. The fold line was worn in the specific way paper wore when it had been unfolded and refolded many times. She handed it back to him without speaking. He put it back in the drawer. Okay, she said. Let's call your lawyers. The next 3 days were the most compressed of her professional life. The legal agreements were drafted and signed on the first day. Her conditions met exactly as stated. The lion dissolved by 4 in the afternoon with a confirmation document that she photographed and sent to her mother, who called her immediately and was not calm. Zuri let her mother not be calm for a few minutes and then said, I know, I'll explain everything later. Right now I need to focus. And her mother, who had always understood the difference between emotional support and practical interference, said go and hung up. The staged engagement was formalized in the simplest possible way. A brief internal communication to the Kang family's legal team, noting that the contract's conditions were being addressed and that a public announcement would follow at an appropriate time. Mrs. Kang signed the restructuring agreement for the penalty clause with the particular expression of a woman who had gotten what she wanted and was choosing not to show it. Taehyun sat across from his mother at the signing table, and there was between them a silence that Zuri watched from across the room, dense with history, with the specific weight of a relationship between two people who loved each other and had very different ideas about how that should operate. She looked away. It wasn't her silence to read. The second and third days were the brand presentation. She worked alongside 3 members of the design team she had built relationships with over 18 months, Ji-yeon among them, who had come to Zuri's new workspace on the executive floor on the first morning, looked at the identity system spread across the table and said, with the precise understatement Zuri had come to recognize as her highest form of praise, "This is correct." Then she had sat down and started working without being asked. The board presentation was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9. 32 people in the main conference room. Board members, senior executives, 2 external partners. The kind of room where presentations went to be approved or dismantled, where the quality of the work was secondary to the quality of the delivery, where every person present had the authority to say no. She walked in at 8:58 with her portfolio and her own name on the agenda, and Ji-yeon 3 steps behind her, and she stood at the front of the room while the board filed in, and she did not look at the door until everyone was seated. Tae-hyun came in last. He took his seat at the head of the table. He looked at her once, brief, direct, and then looked at the presentation screen. She began. She had given many presentations in her career, good ones and mediocre ones. Presentations where she was performing competence, and presentations where she was actually thinking out loud. This was neither of those. This was something else. The specific experience of standing in front of people and telling the truth about what she saw clearly, without softening, with the full weight of 18 months of internal observation behind every claim she made. She didn't perform. She didn't oversell. She laid out the problem as she had diagnosed it. The split identity, the aesthetic masking of a conceptual gap, the years of commissioned work that had addressed the symptoms without touching the disease, and then she showed what the alternative looked like, what a brand system built on acknowledged tension looked like, what it meant to present to the world as an organization that understood its own complexity and had chosen precision over concealment. The room was quiet in the specific way rooms were quiet when the people in them were listening hard. She was 40 minutes in when the first pushback came. It came from a board member on her left, a man named Choi, who had said nothing until this point and who now leaned forward and said, in the tone of someone who had decided to test rather than engage, "The system you're describing asks the company to acknowledge certain aspects of its history that have been deliberately managed away from the public record. The risk profile of that decision is significant. She looked at him. The risk profile of continuing to build identity work on a foundation that the internal team can't maintain is also significant. You've had 4 major brand inconsistency incidents in the past 2 years. 3 of them were in digital platforms. The 4th was in a high-visibility partnership announcement that had to be retracted and reissued. She kept her voice level. I've read the incident reports. The inconsistency isn't cosmetic. It's structural. And it will get worse, not better if the foundation doesn't change. You've read the incident reports, Choi said. I've been in this company for 18 months, she said, under a different name, which is a separate conversation that I'm prepared to have with anyone in this room who wants to have it. But the access I had in that time was real, and what I built from it is in front of you. The room was very still. Taehyun said nothing. He was watching the room. Choi looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the screen. Then he looked back at her. Continue, he said. She continued. The presentation ended at 10:47. The room deliberated for 11 minutes, which was fast by any standard. And when the board chair looked up from the table, he said, "We'll move forward with the proposed system. Implementation timeline and budget to be confirmed by end of week." Jiyeon, standing at the back of the room, allowed herself one brief, precise nod. Zuri closed her portfolio. She was packing up at the front of the room when the board members filed out, when the executives stopped to speak to each other in the low-register way of people who had made a large decision and were already thinking about the next one, when the room thinned to 3 people and then 2 and then 1. Taehyun was still at the table. He had not moved through the clearing of the room. He sat at the head of the table with his hands flat on the surface in front of him, and he looked at her with an expression she didn't have a word for. Not pride, which would have been the wrong register entirely, but something that lived in the same general territory as relief. Choi hasn't been challenged in that room in 4 years, he said. She picked up her portfolio. He was wrong. He knows that. That's why he backed down. He stood. The board doesn't approve systems in 11 minutes. I know. They took 11 minutes. She looked at him. Is that your way of saying the work was good? It's my way of saying the work was true, he said, which is different. She stood with her portfolio and the remains of the most consequential presentation of her career, and the knowledge that the legal agreements were signed and the arrangement was in place and everything she had been running toward and away from for 18 months had arrived, and she felt, not triumph, not relief exactly, but something quieter and stranger than either. The specific feeling of having stopped pretending. There's a rooftop terrace, she said, on this building. I've seen it from the street, but I've never been up. He looked at her for a moment. 42nd floor? The elevator access requires a key card. You have a key card? Yes. She looked at the window. Outside Seoul? No, Manhattan. She had to stop superimposing futures onto the present. Manhattan spread in every direction under a sky that had been gray all day and was now, in the late afternoon, attempting something almost like light. I'd like to go up, she said. After. After what? After everything. After the lawyers and the calls and the whatever comes next. She picked up her bag. I'd like to go up when it's dark and the city is lit, and I'd like to stand somewhere that isn't an office or a conference room or a corridor and just... She stopped. Looked at him. I've been in this building for 18 months, and I've never just stood somewhere in it. He was quiet for a moment. Tonight, he said. Tonight. She nodded once and walked to the door, and she was almost through it when his voice came across the room again. Quieter this time than the presentation quiet, the specific quiet of a person saying something they had not scripted. Zuri. She stopped, turned. He was still standing at the head of the table, both hands at his sides now, and there was something in his posture that she hadn't seen before. A fraction of the control released, the composed surface giving way just slightly, enough that she could see underneath it the outline of something that had been there for a long time, and that he had been, in his own way, just as carefully not showing as she had been, not showing the equivalent thing in herself. The nonprofit, he said, the literacy program, are they still operating? She blinked. Of all the things she expected him to say, yes, she said. They expanded last year, new location in the South Bronx. He nodded once. I'd like to discuss a funding partnership when there's time. She looked at him for a moment. When there's time, she said. She went back to her temporary workspace on the executive floor and sat down and looked at the city through the glass and breathed for the first time all day without her shoulders up around her ears. And she thought about tonight and the rooftop and the lit city and the particular quality of a conversation that had not finished yet but that she was no longer afraid of having. Her phone rang. She picked it up without checking the screen. Bennett? The voice on the other end was not one she recognized. Male, Korean-accented English, clipped and professional, and with something underneath the professionalism that took her a second to identify as urgency. Ms. Bennett, my name is Park Sung-jin. I'm calling from the office of Kang Tae-hyun's legal counsel. A pause. There has been a development with the board vote. I need you to stay in the building. She sat up. What kind of development? One of the board members, Mr. Choi, has filed an emergency objection to the approval. He's claiming that the presentation was made under false pretenses, that the identity of the lead designer was misrepresented to the board, and that the approval should be vacated pending an investigation. Her jaw tightened. My identity was disclosed, in the presentation, in front of the full board. He's arguing the disclosure was insufficient, and that the board was not given adequate time to consider the implications of approving a project led by someone who used a fraudulent identity to gain access to the company. Another pause. He's also filed a separate complaint with the company's ethics board, alleging that the staged engagement announcement constitutes a manipulation of company governance. She stood up. There's more. The voice was careful now. Mr. Choi has indicated that he has documentation about the original contract between your family and the Kang family, about the financial arrangements surrounding it. He's suggesting the documentation is sufficient to bring the arrangement into public scrutiny. She was already moving toward the door. Where is Tae-hyun? She said. He's in an emergency meeting with the board chair. Ms. Bennett, the voice dropped slightly. Mr. Choi is not acting alone. We believe there are 2 other board members who coordinated with him in advance. This was planned before the presentation. She stopped in the doorway. Before, she said. The objection documentation was pre-prepared. It was filed within minutes of the vote closing. A beat. Someone gave him the information about the contract and about your history in this company before today. Someone with access to materials that should have been confidential. The cold that moved through her was different from the cold in the restaurant. That cold had been about fear. This one was about something else. The specific ice of understanding that the situation was larger than she had mapped it, that there was a piece she had not seen, that someone in the architecture of this day had been positioned somewhere she hadn't looked. She thought about the folder Mrs. Kang had produced in Sora, the complete financial picture, assembled with resources and access that spoke to significant reach. She thought about 4 months of surveillance she hadn't detected. She thought about the particular precision of the objection's timing. Who? She said. Her voice was flat and hard. The lawyer's pause was 1 beat too long. We don't know yet, he said. But she was already thinking about the only person who had known everything, the contract, her identity, the staged arrangement, the presentation, the board vote timing, from the beginning. The only person whose access to all of it was structural rather than incidental. The only person who had shown her the folder as a display of knowledge and called it a disclosure rather than a... She didn't finish the sentence in her head. She didn't need to. She was already moving down the corridor toward the conference room where Tae-hyun was meeting with the board chair, her phone still in her hand, the lawyer's voice trailing into silence because she had stopped listening and started thinking, and the thinking had landed her in one place with the particular finality of a door closing. Mrs. Kang. Not because the evidence was complete, not because she had a document or a recording or a chain of proof that would hold up in a room full of lawyers. Because of the folder. Because of 4 months of surveillance presented as disclosure. Because of the specific precision of a woman who had always been several moves ahead of everyone in her vicinity and who had shown Zuri that precision in a restaurant on 54th Street as something between a warning and an audition. The question was not whether. The question was why. What Mrs. Kang had expected to happen. What outcome she had been building toward. Whether Choi's objection was a weapon aimed at the company or a lever aimed at something else entirely. Zuri stopped outside the conference room door. She could hear voices inside. Low, controlled, the specific register of men managing a crisis with other men present. She put her hand on the door handle and then took it off and stood in the corridor for 10 seconds and thought clearly. Walking in there right now with what she had, which was inference and pattern recognition, and 18 months of watching a family operate from the inside. That was not the move. That was emotion. That was the version of herself that had walked into Taehyun's office yesterday with a dissolution agreement and no leverage and called it a plan. She needed the actual move. She went back to the workspace. She sat down. She opened her laptop and pulled up everything she had access to, which was still significant because the implementation approval meant her system credentials hadn't been revoked yet. And she started looking. She was looking for the leak, not the destination of the information, but the source. Choi had pre-prepared documentation, which meant someone had given it to him before today, which meant there was a transaction somewhere, an email, a transfer, a communication that moved information from inside the company's confidential record to outside it. She had been a designer in this building for 18 months. She had also, in the process of building the brand audit, mapped a significant portion of the company's internal communication architecture. She knew which systems talked to which systems. She knew where the gaps were. She found it in 40 minutes. Not the communication itself. She didn't have access to executive email, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But she found the record of a document access event, a file in the company's legal archive, flagged as confidential, that had been accessed 6 days ago by a credential set that belonged to the office of the chairman's family liaison, Mrs. Kang's administrative access. The file was the original contract, the complete version with all exhibits and amendments, including the financial terms and the penalty clause structure and the names of both families in full. She sat back in her chair. She looked at what she had. It was not a confession. It was not proof of coordination with Choi. It was an access record showing that the file had been opened, which a competent lawyer would argue was entirely legitimate, given Mrs. Kang's retained authorities. But it was a thread. And threads, if you pulled them from the right angle, sometimes unraveled things faster than direct confrontation. She printed the access record. She put it in her portfolio with the presentation materials. She stood up and she went back to the conference room, and this time she knocked twice and opened the door without waiting. 3 people inside. Taehyun at the head of the table, the board chair. A man named Woo, 60s, with the exhausted look of someone who had been managing institutional crises for decades. And Daniel, standing near the credenza with a tablet and an expression of controlled alarm. All 3 looked at her. "I need 5 minutes," she said. To Taehyun specifically. Woo started to say something. Taehyun held up one hand. Minimal, not aggressive, just a gesture that meant wait. And looked at Zuri. His face was controlled in the way it was controlled when he was carrying something significant and had decided not to show it. She had learned to read the specific texture of that control. "Give us the room," he said. Wu looked at him, looked at Zuri, stood with the deliberate movement of a man registering his objection through posture rather than words, and he and Daniel left, and the door closed. She put the access record on the table. He looked at it, picked it up, read it. His expression didn't change, but something in the room changed. A shift in pressure, slight, the way the air changed before weather. "She gave Choi the contract," Zuri said. "Yes." His voice was quiet. "You already knew." He set the record down. "I suspected. I didn't have documentation." He looked at her. "Where did you find this?" "The brand audit gave me a working map of the internal communication systems. I know where the archive logs are stored." She sat down across from him, not because she needed to, but because she had been standing for 4 hours and her legs were done negotiating. Tae-hyun. Why would she do this? She got what she wanted. The arrangement is in place. The contract conditions are being met. She has everything she pushed for. Why activate Choi? He was quiet for a moment. He turned the access record once in his hands, and she watched his face and saw the thing she had seen on the rooftop in her mind. The tiredness, the weight behind the control. And this time it was closer to the surface than it had ever been. "Because she doesn't want the staged arrangement," he said. "She never wanted the staged arrangement." He set the record down flat. "She wants the real one. She activated Choi because she believes that if the company comes under enough pressure, if the board approval is vacated and the brand project collapses and the ethics complaint creates enough noise, I'll have no choice but to formalize the engagement immediately and permanently in order to stabilize the situation." The contract fulfilled completely, not in stages. No dissolution at the end. The room was very still. "She engineered the crisis," Zuri said, "to force your hand." "She's done it before. With other situations. Other decisions." He looked at the table. It's how she operates when she believes I'm being, as she puts it, sentimental. Zuri thought about the restaurant, the folder on the table positioned in the neutral space between them. I'm not doing that. I'm showing you the landscape. She thought about the particular quality of the older woman's attention. Sharp, patient, always 3 steps ahead. She thought about the word practical, which Mrs. Kang had used twice, and which meant something different in her vocabulary than it did in anyone else's. She knows I figured it out, Zuri said. Probably. He looked up. She would expect you to. And she knows you know. Yes. So what happens now, Zuri said. Because from where I'm sitting, Choi's objection is still filed, the ethics complaint is still active, and we have an access record that shows who sourced the leak but doesn't prove coordination. Your mother's lawyers will argue legitimate access all day and into next week, and they won't be wrong. She pressed her hands flat on the table. I need to understand what you're going to do. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm going to dissolve her authorities, he said. Today. The retained legacy access, all of it, across every system and every legal structure. I told you yesterday I was planning to. I'm going to do it now, in writing, with the board chair as witness, which removes her standing to have made the access in the first place and retroactively delegitimizes any action taken on information obtained through that access. He paused. Including Choi's objection. She looked at him. That's aggressive. Yes. It will damage your relationship with her. Yes. She searched his face for the things she wanted to know. Whether this was a calculated move or something else. Whether he was managing a crisis or making a choice. The difference mattered. She had spent 18 months learning to read him, and she needed the reading to be right. What she saw was not calculation. What she saw was a man who had made a decision that had been coming for a long time and had been waiting for the moment when the cost of not making it finally exceeded the cost of making it, and had found that moment here, in this room, with this particular weight on the table between them. Okay, she said. I'll need an hour. I'll be here. She started to stand. He said her name, Zuri, and she stopped. After, he said, the rooftop. If that's still, it's still, she said. And she left him to the work. The hour was closer to 2. She spent it in the workspace, drafting implementation notes for the brand system with the focused calm of someone who has been through the worst of a day and come out the other side still standing. Jian appeared at the door at one point, looked at her, looked at the notes on the screen, said, Choi withdrew the objection, with the same precise economy she brought to everything, and then looked at Zuri a moment longer than usual, not asking a question, not offering commentary, just acknowledging something, and left. The ethics complaint was retracted 40 minutes later. Daniel sent her a single-line message. Board approval stands. Implementation confirmed. She read it twice. Then she saved her notes, closed her laptop, and sat for a moment with the quiet. It didn't feel like victory. She had expected it to feel like something larger, the release of 18 months of maintained tension, the end of the double life, the resolution of the contract that had been hanging over her family since before she was old enough to understand what contracts were. She had expected some version of catharsis. What it felt like was tiredness. Real tiredness, not the performative exhaustion of someone who had pushed through too much. The genuine bone-level tiredness of a person who had been holding something heavy for a very long time and had finally set it down and was only now feeling the full weight of what they had been carrying. She was still sitting with it when Tai Hyun appeared in the doorway. He looked tired too. It was the first time she had ever seen it openly in his posture, the shoulders not quite at their usual set, the controlled surface present but thinner, the tiredness showing through. He had a keycard in his hand. Ready? He said. They went up together in the executive elevator. 42 floors. No conversation. She was aware of the specific quality of the silence between them. Different from the loaded silence of his office yesterday, different from the careful managed distance of 18 months. This was the silence of two people who had run out of things to perform and had landed somewhere realer than either of them had been prepared for. The rooftop was cold. The door opened onto a terrace that was larger than she'd imagined from the street. A sweep of dark concrete and low plantings, the building's mechanical systems a low hum behind the far wall, the city spread in every direction below them in its full November brilliance. The lights of Manhattan at night were not beautiful in a gentle way. They were relentless, excessive, The city making its ongoing argument that it existed and mattered and was not going to be quiet about it. She walked to the railing. She put her hands on the cold metal and looked out and breathed the cold air and let the tiredness be what it was. He came to stand beside her, not close enough to touch, just beside her, which was its own kind of thing, after everything. They stood there for a while without speaking. The city moved below them. A helicopter crossed the midtown air to the south. Somewhere far below, a siren started and faded, and another took its place in the way that sirens did in this city, the constant, low-level reminder that things were always happening somewhere. "Your mother," Zuri said finally. "Yes." "Is she—" She stopped, reconfigured. "What happens with her now?" "She'll be angry for a while," he said. "She'll feel that I've moved against her, which, in the term she uses for these things, I have." He paused. "She'll also understand it eventually. She understands power, and she understands when someone has made an irreversible decision. She doesn't respect capitulation." A beat. "She may respect this." "She respected the boundary you drew yesterday," Zuri said, "when you called her." "Yes." "She told me, in the restaurant." He looked at her. "What else did she tell you?" Zuri considered the question, considered the woman in the restaurant with her small, precise hands and the folder on the table and the specific weight of what she'd said. "I want my son to have someone who is not afraid of him." "She told me the truth," Zuri said, in her way, about what she wanted and why. It wasn't gentle, but it was honest. He was quiet. "She loves you," Zuri said. "The methods are—" She exhaled, a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh, aggressive. "But the foundation of it is real." "I know," he said. "I've always known that." He looked at the city. "It doesn't make the methods acceptable." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." The cold settled around them. Zuri's hands were going numb on the railing, but she didn't move them. She was thinking about the version of herself that had stood on a subway platform 8 months into this with the contract in her bag, making the decision to go inside. What she had thought she was building, what she had actually built. "The arrangement," she said, "the staged one. I agreed to it this morning." She looked at the city. "I want to revisit the terms." He was still beside her. "How?" "I don't want it to be staged," she said. The words were out before she had fully decided to say them, which told her something about how long they had been waiting. He didn't respond immediately. She felt him go very still in the way he went still when he was paying complete attention. "I've been running from this for 18 months, she said. "And before that, for the 2 weeks between finding the contract and walking into your building. And probably for longer than that, if I'm being honest, because the contract was always the thing I blamed. But I think what I was actually afraid of was—" She stopped, looked at her hands on the railing. "Being chosen by someone before I'd figured out who I was. Being someone's answer before I'd understood the question. And now," he said. His voice was careful, not guarded, careful, in the way of someone handling something they did not want to break. "And now I know the question," she said. "I spent 18 months in your company being more fully myself than I had been anywhere before. And I did it under a fake name, which is maybe the most absurd sentence I've ever said out loud." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her already. He had been looking at her. "I know who I am. I know what I want to build. I'm not afraid of you. I'm not afraid of your mother, which I think she already knows." She paused. "I'm asking you if there's something real here that started before the arrangement, before today." "Mamushki to sasmi cherent." He held her gaze for a long moment. "You know there is," he said. "You've known for longer than you've let yourself admit." She had. She had known in his office in the early winter, in the meeting that had lasted 40 minutes longer than it needed to because neither of them had wanted it to end. She had known on the rooftop during the corporate party, standing at the railing feeling his attention cross 20 feet of crowded terrace and find her with the specific quality of something deliberate. She had known when she read the access record, and her first thought was not about the legal implications, but about him. "The catalog page," she said. "Yes." "You kept it for 3 years before I ever walked into your building." "Yes." "That's—" She stopped. "Strange," he said. "I was going to say something else." "I know." And there it was, the thing she had almost never seen from him, the thing beneath the control, the warmth that lived under all that careful management, the edge of something that was almost a smile, brief and real, and more of an answer than anything he could have said. She looked at him in the cold night air on the roof of a building she had entered under a false name and was going to leave as herself, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not dramatically, not in the way that stories suggested these things happened, but in the quiet, specific way of a lock releasing, something that had been held finally letting go. "The design studio," she said. "When this project is done, I want to build my own practice." She said it cleanly because it needed to be said before anything else. "Under my own name. My own clients, my own terms. That's not negotiable." "I know," he said. "It never was. I'm telling you because I need you to understand that this," she gestured between them, a small movement, "doesn't change that. Whatever this is." "Whatever this is," he agreed, "doesn't change that." He looked at her steadily. "I have no interest in you becoming something smaller, Zuri. I spent 3 years keeping a catalog page of someone's work because it showed me what it looked like when a person made something true. I'm not going to ask you to stop making true things." She breathed. The city moved below. She reached across the railing and put her hand over his, cold fingers against cold fingers, simple, without performance. And they stood like that for a while, looking at Manhattan spread below them in all its relentless, excessive light, and she let herself be in it without running from it. The months that followed did not resolve themselves cleanly. Nothing real ever did. Mrs. Kang did not speak to her son for 6 weeks after the dissolution of her authorities. When she finally called, the conversation lasted 11 minutes, and Taehyun did not share its contents, and Zuri did not ask. What she observed in the weeks after that was a gradual recalibration, not reconciliation in the way movies presented it, warm and conclusive, but the harder, slower version, two strong-willed people who loved each other finding new terms. Mrs. Kang attended the brand system launch event in December and did not speak to Zuri directly, but stood in front of the identity display for 4 minutes, which Ji-yeon clocked with the precision of a person who tracked significant things and said afterward, with her characteristic understatement, that 4 minutes was a long time. Choi resigned from the board in January. He cited personal reasons. Nobody who had been in the conference room believed that. The brand implementation ran 7 months, longer than projected because real things always ran longer than projected because organizations resisted change with the specific stubbornness of entities that had survived by remaining consistent and did not trust, at a cellular level, the instruction to be different. Zuri fought for every element of the system with the focused precision of someone who understood that good work required protection. She fought in meetings and in emails and in one very direct conversation with a subsidiary director who had decided unilaterally to revert to the old logo system in which she laid out the contractual terms of the implementation agreement in sufficient detail that the director did not make that choice again. Jiyeon told her afterward that it had been impressive. Zuri said it had been necessary. Jiyeon said those were often the same thing. She moved out of the Crown Heights apartment in February, not because she needed to, but because she had been there for 3 years, and it had been her hiding place, and it no longer fit the shape of her life. She found a space in Bed-Stuy with better north light and room for a drafting table and a small meeting area, and she signed the lease under Zuri Bennett Studio, which was a name she had written in a sketchbook once, and then crossed out because it had felt presumptuous, and now did not. Her relationship with her mother required its own separate reconstruction. Margaret Bennett had known, on some level, that the letter existed, that the activation was possible, and had made choices about what to share and when that had cost Zuri time and security and the particular kind of trust that was hardest to rebuild. They had 2 very difficult conversations about this, the kind that left both of them depleted and said things that were true and that neither of them had said before. Her mother was not a villain. Her mother was a woman who had been frightened for 15 years and had managed her fear the way frightened people managed it, which was imperfectly and with too much silence. Zuri did not forgive easily because she was not built for easy forgiveness. She forgave because her mother was in the picture she was building of her life, and she was not willing to leave that space empty. By spring, the studio had 3 clients. By summer, it had 7. By the time she sat down to take stock of it, she was doing the work she had imagined doing in the abstract for years, the kind of work that required the whole version of her, the one that was not performing and not hiding, the version that had been trying to get out since before she walked into a building under a false name and accidentally built something real. Taehyun came to Lisbon in April. She had not planned Lisbon specifically. She had needed to leave New York for a month between implementation wrap-up and studio launch, needed to put physical distance between the chapter she was closing and the one she was opening, and she had landed in Lisbon for reasons that felt more instinctive than rational. The light, the particular quality of a city that had survived centuries of pressure and still faced the ocean without apology. She stayed for 3 weeks and worked in a cafe near the Tagus with her sketchbook and her laptop, and nobody who knew her name. She called Taehyun on the second week, not because they hadn't been in contact. They had the regular communication of two people navigating a complicated situation across a distance, but because she had something to tell him that required his actual voice and not a text message. "I want to come back to New York for the studio," she said, "but I'm keeping this." A pause. "I don't know what that means logistically. I don't know how it fits. I'm not asking you to solve it." "Okay," he said. "I'm telling you because whatever this is between us, it needs to know the whole picture." "I understand." "You travel," she said. "You have offices in 4 cities." "Yes." "One of them could be here." A pause. Short. "Yes," he said. "It could." She sat with that for a moment. Outside the cafe window, the Tagus moved in its slow Atlantic way, brown and wide and patient. "Come in April," she said. "I want to show you the light." He came in April. He walked into the cafe where she was working on a Tuesday morning. She had not gone to meet him at the airport because she was finishing a deadline and he had told her not to, and she had believed him, and she was learning, slowly, to believe him on the small things. And he sat down across from her without ceremony and ordered coffee from the waiter in Portuguese that was accented but correct, which surprised her. And when the coffee arrived, he wrapped his hands around the cup and looked at the light coming through the window and was quiet for a moment. "You were right," he said, "about the light." "Yes." She looked at him across the table in the April light of a cafe in Lisbon, no disguise between them, no contract overhead, no managed distance, just the full unmediated version of both of them, which she was still getting used to and suspected she might be getting used to for a long time, which was not the same as it being wrong. "There's a studio space 2 streets from here," she said. "I looked at it yesterday. The landlord will do a short-term arrangement." He looked at her. "I'm not saying you have to," she said. "I'm saying it exists." He picked up his coffee. "Send me the address." She sent him the address. Outside, the river moved. The city went about its business in the way old cities did, with the equanimity of something that had outlasted many urgent things and expected to outlast more. The light came through the window at the angle she had tried to describe to him on the phone, but that only made sense in person, warm and slightly gold, the kind of light that made whatever it touched look like it had always been exactly where it was. She pulled her sketchbook toward her and kept working. He drank his coffee and read something on his phone and did not ask what she was working on, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him, that he paid attention without requiring ownership of what he paid attention to. The studio opened in New York in June. The yellow door was her idea. She had sketched it in Lisbon on a Tuesday afternoon and known immediately that it was right. The specific yellow of something that was not trying to be subtle, something that wanted to be seen from a distance. On the door, in clean black letters, Zuri Bennett Studio. She stood in front of it on the morning of the opening and looked at her name on the door and felt something she did not have an exact word for. Not triumph, not arrival, because she had been arriving in stages for months. Something quieter. The particular feeling of a thing that had been imagined for so long finally becoming solid, taking up actual space in the world, casting an actual shadow. Her mother came to the opening. Her brother Marcus came, and her youngest sister, who was 17 and stood in front of the identity work on the studio walls with the specific quality of attention that Zuri recognized as someone seeing something they hadn't known they could want. Taehyun came. He stood near the back of the space during the opening with the particular quality of presence he had in rooms, there without requiring acknowledgement, watching without performing the watching. She caught his eye across the studio once, in the middle of a conversation with a client she was trying to close, and he looked at her with the expression she had first seen clearly on the rooftop, the warmth under the management, the thing that had been there since before she knew his name. She held his gaze for one beat and then went back to the conversation, which was the right choice, and he knew it was the right choice, and that knowing was its own kind of thing. Later, after the clients and the family had gone and the studio was quiet, He stayed to help her move the furniture back to working position, the chairs and the display easels and the table that had been shifted for the reception. And they worked in comfortable silence for 20 minutes, the studio taking back its working shape around them. When it was done, she stood in the middle of the floor and looked at what she had built, the walls with the work on them, the drafting table by the north window, the yellow door, the name. "It's right," he said, not performing certainty, just saying it because it was true. She looked at the door. "Yes," she said. Across the ocean, in a drawer in an office on the 31st floor of a building in Manhattan, a torn catalog page with a worn fold line sat where it had always sat. A record of the beginning of a thing that had taken 3 years and 1 very long year and a Portuguese cafe in April light to become itself. The contract was gone. The disguise was gone. The fear was gone. What remained was not simple, because nothing real was simple. And she had stopped wanting simple somewhere around the 3rd month of being Rory Blake, when she had realized that the life she was building under a false name was more fully her own than anything she had built before. She picked up her sketchbook from the drafting table. She sat down. She began.